Hello, good afternoon. I have here the seminal book ever written on art history. I'm sure many of you have it in your libraries. It was published in 1950, of course, by E.H. Gombrich. But what you may be surprised to hear is that it does not reference a single female artist. 70 years later, we have a new seminal tome on the topic, of course, The Story of Art by Katy Hessel. And this time, it does not reference a single man. So the question for today is, have we gone too far, or have we not come far enough? We have with us three illustrious speakers to answer this very question, and I'm delighted to introduce artist, historian, broadcaster Katy Hessel, whose Instagram account at The Great Women Artists you are undoubtedly following. We have with us Nick Cullinan, Dr. Cullinan back to the stage as the director of the National Portrait Gallery. And we have with us, for the first time, Flora Yukhnovich, who has been described by the New York Times as the most sought after young artist of her generation, whose references, as you'll hear today, range from Tiepolo to Kim Kardashian. So the topic today is painting women back into art history. You've been framed. And my first question is, Katy, why is that so important today?
Well, Yana, you mentioned this, the story of art, the introductory Bible to art history, and the shocking statistics that come with it. When we think about the institutions in our country, if I asked you what percentage of the National Gallery's collection is by women, would you be shocked if I said 1%? It is 1%. The Royal Academy is still yet to have a female artist solo exhibition in their main space. And in 2020 was the first time the National Gallery ever staged an exhibition by a historic female artist. So this is so important, just important in terms of we need representation. Representation matters. I want people to feel that they can be part of this subject. I want people to feel that they can go to galleries and they can see themselves represented, because otherwise we're studying the history of patriarchy rather than the history of art.
And Katy, just in terms of the museums, I think there's other surprises in terms of the Royal Academy, in terms of what we've seen at the Venice Biennale. Could you also just give us some insights into the firsts that we will be seeing, and then we can ask Nicholas what the National Portrait Gallery is doing to paint women back into the frame?
I mean, the thing is that progress is absolutely happening. Obviously, with all of your guys' initiations is extraordinary. And, that needs to happen. And when we think about the Baltimore Museum of Art in America in 2020, they dedicated a year to collecting art by women. This sort of progress needs to happen. And like you mentioned, the Venice Biennale, this year over 90% of the Venice Biennale was dedicated to women artists. And it was incredibly popular. And I think people are just hungry for these stories, actually, because when we focus on one narrative, it's not enough.
Fantastic. Now, Nick, you are back here for the second time. Last year, I was here as a fellow museum director, and this time as the head of arts at Chanel. We are working on some really exciting projects together. I'd love to hear what this closure of the gallery has meant for you over these years, and maybe, although I know you're not going to reveal until January, maybe this audience can get a preview of what you will be doing to redress the balance.
Thank you, yeah. So as Yana said, at the National Portrait Gallery we're doing a major refurbishment. We've been closed since the summer of 2020, which was maybe fortuitous timing. And it's to reconfigure the whole building, but also the focus is really not just on bricks and mortar, it's about the collection. So as I'm sure many of you know, we're doing this fantastic project with the Chanel Culture Funds, working with Yana, focusing on really enhancing the representation of women in the collection as both artists and sitters, because of course that's the unique focus of the National Portrait Gallery. And I'll give you some statistics. I have to say I felt pretty bad about them, but I feel weirdly better now hearing about our neighbours, but it's still not good.
Progress is relative.
So
yes.
When we closed in 2020, we had about 900 portraits on display. And of those 900 portraits, 7.6 were by women artists. That's not good, but it's better than some other examples. And around 23% of the sitters were women. So what we've been working on the last 2 years with Yana and the Chanel Culture Fund, we've appointed 3 curators, which is fantastic. It's led by my brilliant colleague, Dr. Flavia Frigieri, who's wonderful, is to really focus on acquiring works by women artists, and we've been doing that and acquiring some wonderful things. Also having the time and the bandwidth and just the means financially to research what we already have. We have so many extraordinary things in the collection that have just never seen the light of day. They've just been languishing. So those have been researched and those stories brought to light. When we reopen next year, there'll also be an exhibition which will be in partnership with the Chanel Culture Fund. I can't say what it is, but it's very exciting. And the sum total of all of that will be, and it's pretty much what Katy said, this is not about trying to be, radical or woke or any of those things. It's to actually just reflect the population you serve. So the National Portrait Gallery, we are funded by all of you in the room, the British taxpayer. We're for people all around the world. And if our collection doesn't represent populations, we're actually kind of limiting our audiences. We're making ourselves obsolete. So it's really just about remaining relevant and engaging in conversations. I mean, there's lots more I could say, but I should probably...
You mentioned the W word, so we have to lean into that.
Yeah.
And I want to know how you balance the desire for this very necessary progress with some of the anti-woke sentiment that you may find among your stakeholders and perhaps even on your board.
Good question. Switching into politician mode.
And you may want to explain to the audience what I mean by some of that as it relates to your progress.
I mean, so again, we all know this, but obviously the last couple of years, specifically in this country and in other countries and contexts too, there's been these kind of so-called culture wars, which I find slightly odd and spurious. I'm very pleased to say I think that representing women is fairly non-contentious, so that's a win, I guess. There's obviously other battles to engage with. I mean, one thing to say is, and I think it's very interesting that you mentioned the Venice Biennale, which I thought was really wonderful this year, curated by Cecilia Alamani, and it's true that 90% of the exhibition was focused on women, and that was rightly pointed out. But when I saw it, I just saw really great artists. I wasn't thinking about gender. And I think the other thing to say is, it's really important that we are able to look at these issues. If we didn't have Chanel's support, we just wouldn't have had the means to address this issue. So that's super important to give these things bandwidth and focus, but ultimately you want to get to a point where it's not just about kind of niche demographics. So again, everything we're doing, and we've been working a lot over the last few years, not just on the building project, and you will see the building transformed when we reopen next year, but again the collection, we're one of the only institutions in the world that actually commissions for our collection. So some of the commissions we've done in the last few years, for example, the portrait of Malala Yousafzai by Shirin Neshat. That was when I was interviewed 8 years ago, and I was asked if I could commission any portrait by any artist. That was my answer. So it was very nice to turn it into reality. The great portrait of Zadie Smith by Toyin Ojo Odutola, which Katy did a wonderful interview with both the artist and Sitra about. And again, it's really just about making us relevant, making us represent, Britain now, what's happening elsewhere in the world. It's very simple. It's about adding to what we have, not taking away.
It's a great point because you mentioned the Baltimore Museum of Art, and of course there was this very disputed discussion in terms of whether the Baltimore Museum of Art should deaccession works in order to just buy works by female artists, which you referenced. So I think that didn't go through in Pennsylvania. I think they did decide to do that, but it's exciting to hear that it is a live debate. There are no answers, but there are amazing female artists like Flora entering the canon. And I'd love to hear, there's so many male role models, including some of those that you refer to as your heroes. How do you navigate this all? Who do you look to for guidance to find the clarity on the other side of this complex issue?
I think I was conscious when I was trying to think about how to paint that there is this idea of male genius kind of baked into painting as a medium. So I look at a lot of old sort of male masters and kind of push against what they're doing. And then it's also kind of like drawing on the amazing women who are working now. And yes, tightrope kind of depends.
I'd love to talk to you about some of those references because of course your paintings would not look out of place here. And one may think that they are from the Rococo era. Of course, Rococo seems so feminine, and yet the references that I've heard in your interviews do often go back to Tiepolo and others. Can you give us an idea of what that canon means for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's the fact that they seem feminine that kind of drew me to them in the first place. The idea of this whole movement in art history that's thought of as like overly frivolous and kind of dismissed as feminine. It all comes under that. But then they are these sort of big male painters, often painting naked women, like served up for the male gaze.
Can you give us some examples, just so we can visualize some of the painters you're thinking of?
So in the Wallace collection, there's these sort of amazing Rising and the Setting of the Sun by Boucher, which have these nymphs at the bottom. And the whole paintings are about movement. They're about the rising and the setting. But then there are these very still female bodies at the bottom that are so fleshy, and they're just sort of laid out there for you, and they're not doing anything. So with things like that, I sort of want to adopt those figures in my work and try and use abstraction as a way to break them down. But yeah, I think it's so interesting that these big male artists have become sort of feminized, and I think they inspire a language which is directed at women, and that's kind of what's interesting to me.
And to round out that topic of museums, I'd love to ask you what museum recognition means. The traditional gatekeepers, of course, have been the curators, they've been the grandees at the museums, and now the tastemakers are often in different environments. I know that you're working on a museum show, we can discuss that soon, but what does the museum mean for you in terms of recognition, in terms of acceptance into that?
Well, I think in terms of recognition, it's sort of, I think to be able to have your work seen next to the people that have inspired your work, and to have it in that context is sort of the way of being seen in the most ultimate way, I guess. But I think it's also, as an artist, you study and you're with your artist cohort and you're only thinking about the meaning of the work and the references and all of those things, and it's sort of like you're trying forevermore to try and get back to that context. And I think the museum is the sort of truest version of that outside the studio.
And I'd love to know, we're looking at where we are now, and in terms of the stats, I think the Burns-Halpern report, which was published several years ago, suggests that out of 31 museums in America, there are 11% representation by female artists. I think there's a new edition coming out in a couple of weeks, and the numbers won't really look that different. It's so surprising to us because you do have these incredible women running museums, Maria Balsha at Tate, Laurence Descartes now at the Louvre. What is the challenge? What is the obstacle? I know that progress is often slow to come, but where do you see those areas where we can really drive transformation to make sure that 11% does move in the next 10 years, although it doesn't seem to have in the past decade?
I mean, it's so interesting you mentioned the heads of the Tate and the Louvre, because actually this is the first time in history that we have women running the show as well. It's the fact that in 2016, when Frances Morris was appointed the director of Tate Modern, it was like this monumental occasion, and everyone's like, oh my God, a first female Tate director, and it's like, that's insane. Yeah. The Tate is hundreds of years old. And actually, that was just 6 years ago, and look how much progress we've already made in 6 years. And I think this is such an exciting time because, if we have more women in power, or more people in power who actually care about representation, that's the direction that we need to be going in, the conversations. But also it's so interesting, talking about this idea of museums and being accepted into an institution, because as well, this idea of value, and of course prestige is, as valuable as money, but it's the kind of thing where it's, when you look at, you mentioned the 11%, like the highest earning living artist at auction is Jenny Saville, whose work went for just 11% of David Hockney, who's the highest earning male artist at auction. And the thing is, it's almost as though it sort of acts as a microcosm for the value that we place on genders in society, and actually it has this kind of ripple effect. And it's like, when we look at the FTSE 100 or the gender pay gap, it sort of all feeds into that.
Well, I think that also takes us back to Baselitz' point, where he said,
yes,
women aren't just as good as men, the markets don't lie. And what you reference, of course, I think the most expensive artwork ever sold at auction, Salvador Mundi, which has come back into the press, 450 million. Georgia O'Keeffe, just over 40 million. So the question is, if we look at the market, are men 10 times as good as women? Anyone who would like to answer that?
Nicholas.
I guess I should. Okay. I mean, it's actually very interesting having this conversation, having listened to Edward Enninfeld's wonderful talk earlier on today, which I'm sure many of you were really fortunate to hear. And obviously he works in a different context. And I've talked to Edward a lot over the years about what he's doing, and we've been kind of comparing notes about how you affect change, especially in a particular context, like Vogue or the MPG or whatever. And I think the first thing to say is that some of those rules that we're told, like that black women don't sell magazines, not true. He's disproven that. That, you know, women, I mean, what Basil had said, which I find appalling, maybe we live with some of those things and we don't question them. And the point is that actually once you begin to push against them, they very quickly can change. And if you look at the art market now, you know, I would say that's changed massively the last few years. There's still a long way to go. But the very small circle of the artists that commanded extraordinary prices has completely changed. And now, for example, you know, so many galleries are looking at, you know, African American artists or women artists, or you can change these things. There's an idea that somehow something is fixed, and I really think it's not the case. The other thing to say, just from the kind of museum perspective, is it's not just like about allowing people in to work there, to run them as visitors. Like, we need those people. We need the best people to work in museums. We need the best people to run museums. We need, you know, a big audience. Otherwise, we just can't keep going. So, you know, we're reliant on these things as well to keep. There's that wonderful quote from The Leopard by Giuseppe Tommaso de Lampedusa, where he says, and it's all about the kind of Sicilian aristocracy. And one of the characters said, if we want things to stay the same, then things are going to have to change. And it's so true that if you value traditions, you obviously want to kind of cherish them and keep them going, but you also have to constantly, subtly reinvent them and really reinvigorate them as well.
I'll return your quote on one, which is diversity is being invited to the party and inclusion is being asked to dance.
Yeah.
And you mentioned Francis Morris, and I remember in 2016, when I was running Intelligence Squared, we invited Francis to Hong Kong to do a debate about the art world being a boys' club. I'm going to read a quote by Francis, and then I would love to ask Flora in terms of whether you feel you are included in the boys' club, or whether you still feel that for you there's some areas to navigate, and if so, who helps you navigate those spaces? So, just by chance, because you mentioned Francis, the international director of the Tate, she had told the FT in one article, women artists have fared very poorly because there's been an unconscious collusion between the marketplace, art history, and the institutions. Everybody lacks confidence, everybody's looking for confirmation, so there's been a sort of conformational history, which you could call the canon, and of course, convention and history were framed by patriarchy, so I guess history is written by the winners. Flora, maybe I can ask you in terms of how you feel.
Yeah, I think, I mean, in terms of who you look at when you're learning, it is a boys' club, like massively. And then I think the art world now, it still feels a bit that way. Like, I still think, well, I'm interested in the idea of gendered aesthetics and what's taken seriously and what's not if they have a gender kind of attributed to them. And I think that still seems to be quite a big point now, that there's still kind of a serious aesthetic or serious look to a lot of these artworks that are really valued, and there's quite a sort of male idea. But I think people are doing amazing work. I mean, Katy's doing amazing work. And I think there is like a real appetite to get new voices in and get things seen. But sometimes I worry that it's talked about like a trend, and it's like how do we get past that and make sure that there is like the deep scholarship in the way that there has been about the male artists, and that there's real parity.
And how do you find, in terms of your language, which does reference Rubens in the same spirit of Brigitte Bardot and Lady Gaga, how do you find speaking to a universe of perhaps journalists and gallerists who are so much older than you are, in terms of bridging between the history and the future?
It's really, it does massively depend on the age of people, I think. A lot of the references, the contemporary references that I'm using are to do with reality TV, which in the art world people don't really love reality TV as much as I do, so it doesn't land that often. But I think that's what's exciting is kind of talking about the work with some people who can see every single reference as exactly what it is and exactly where it comes from, and some people who just see it as a kind of broad aesthetic and they can feel the contemporary parts in it. And for me, that's really inspiring to have different kind of levels of conversation. and different responses.
We're going to come back to the reality television because I know we want to know what you are watching and listening to and looking at because the way that you express that is really, really so incredibly modern. But I'd love to ask Katy, in terms of titles like Wet and Wild, how do you navigate the contemporality of artists like Flora and their modern references, and then this canon, which I'm sure is the tip of the iceberg? So I would love to hear about the modernity, but then also get a couple of good stories from you in terms of what you unearthed in the story of art without men.
So, I mean, this book really spans from Renaissance to the present day, and it starts in about 1550. And we start with paintings. We start with oil paintings, and actually we end in the 2020s. And Flora is one of the artists who I choose as the kind of new masters. And the reason why I did that is also because it's this idea of oil paint. I mean, this book, again, to sort of break down the canon, also includes sculptors, weavers, textile makers, everything, because also the canon should not just be oil painting. But I did think it was very interesting that in the Renaissance we start with people like Sophonisba Anguissola, who was an extraordinary painter working in the 1550s. I can maybe get it up if that's all right. And she made this, already, I mean, first of all, women artists were banned from even painting or studying the nude from life until the 1890s. And so it's the fact that they already had so many barriers to break down. And so the fact that we actually know who these women were it's extraordinary. Like they were total, just fearless people who just demanded their place in art history and actually sort of, work around that. Women artists, especially in the Renaissance era, were often reduced to, or not even reduced to, but, restricted to portraiture and still life. And, genres considered lesser by the establishment, even though we know that's bullshit. But it's like, and so what they did, they sort of interwove like portraits into their still life works as if to, not let men claim their artwork as their own, because dealers in the 19th century would literally cross out a woman artist's name and replace it with a male artist so it could sell for higher. But for example, I want to show you this work by Sophonisba Anguissola from the 1550s, and at first what we might think is already she's playing with gender, like sort of power structures with gender. It's a painting of her teacher painting her, but she's actually painted herself 1.5 times as big as him. She's painted him painting the sort of embellishment of her jacket, which is something normally assigned to an apprentice. And actually, if we look really closely, I'm sorry, I have to look at the book afterwards. But
you might even have to buy it.
but she's actually got her hand guiding his wrist, which is extraordinary. And to then sort of, what I love about this book sort of coming together is you look at how women were playing with oil paint then, and then you look at it with Flora playing with it now, and actually we're still kind of uncovering those power structures, and it's so exciting to think that this medium is so old, yet people are reinventing it in such an interesting way. We live in this digital age. We're all on Instagram. Like, I probably met Flora on Instagram, and actually what the digital age can kind of do for us now. And I love the fact that you are so. I recently had an exhibition of the final chapter of the book, and people were just so drawn to your work who'd never even sort of stepped inside a museum. And I think that's the appeal of your work as well. It reminds people of culture today, but also, for those people who are sort of embedded in art history, also reminds that. And it's this incredible kind of culmination of society and culture and references that I think people are dazzled by.
It was amazing. We were just in Korea for Frieze Art Fair, and to walk into the first Korean collection and then to have this incredible collector say, "This is Cy Twombly, and this is Flora," and then she might have stumbled on your surname. But it was so amazing also to see how quickly, within that visual canon, there is that collision of centuries and how rules do get broken like that. Katy has the show at Victoria Miro, which I had the pleasure of seeing with her last week. And there's a great anecdote there about the Celia Paul, which I think might be going into the National Portrait Gallery.
It is.
And there's a Freud in the background. Maybe you can tell us how a man was painted in or out of the picture in that painting that we discussed.
Well, congratulations, that's amazing. So actually the painting I just told you about with the woman painting her teacher painting her, Celia, I had a conversation with Celia Paul a few years ago, and she was so inspired by it.
Can you reference Celia Paul?
Yeah, so Celia Paul is a fantastic British painter focusing on portraits. She kind of talks about how she's a kind of chronicler of her life and family, so she paints those close to her. But very famously, when she was 17, she went out with Lucian Freud, who was in his 40s or 50s at this point. and he was not only her lover,
Who's
but
he?
also... Don't worry about it. But not only was he her lover, but also her teacher. So she was inspired by that painting. And to sort of bring that conversation of 500 years is extraordinary. And she painted Freud originally, but actually rubbed him out. And it's called Overshadowed. And she's sort of appearing, sort of staunch, statue-like. And her gaze is sort of totally featured on us. And it's as though she's claiming back like decades of being in his shadow. I mean, even when the Sunday Times reviewed the show, they even referenced her as Freud's lover. And I was like, no, this is not the point, guys.
Yeah. Can I just follow up with one point that you made about, which I found shocking and extraordinary, that women artists' names were crossed out and then replaced with men, which I suppose shouldn't surprise me, but how awful. However, I have done the same thing, but hopefully for a much better reason. So I think one of the reasons that perhaps we partnered with Chanel is that the last few years we did a lot of exhibitions for contemporary artists who, all of whom were women. And that included Tasta Dean and Gillian Waring and Elizabeth Payton and Cindy Sherman. Claude Cahoon as well, yeah, of course. And so my point is, every time I would get a kind of draft press release for those shows, it would say, for example, Cindy Sherman is one of the most important women artists or female artists working today. And I would always cross out that descriptor, just leave important, with the artist's blessing, I should say. So I wonder how you feel about that, because I think it's very important to have this conversation, but I also feel that everyone, whether you're an artist or you work in a museum, you also want to be valued and respected based on your work, not as a kind of diversity quota or higher. But yeah, I don't know how you
I mean,
view
it's
that.
so interesting because in a way, so I have this Instagram that Yana mentioned called The Great Women Artist, which I set up in October 2015, really after having this kind of epiphany moment going into an art fair in October 2015 and realizing that I didn't see a single artwork by a woman artist, an artist. But then I asked myself, could I name 20 women artists off the top of my head? Did I even know any who existed pre-1950 or 1850? And the answer was no. And actually when the statistics and my knowledge was so shocking, I just thought I have to do something about it. But I mean, it's also interesting that Instagram references a very famous essay called Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists that really kind of kick-started the feminist art movement in the 1970s by Linda Nochlin. And, it's interesting that I've called this the story of art without men as well, to not only be more inclusionary, but also to kind of get rid of that, because of course I want parity and equality among all genders. I think it's the most important thing, but when the statistics remain so shocking, we do almost have to go the other way.
Of course, I agree. And also the depressing thing is, I never get a press release saying George Baselitz is one of the most important male artists. It's taken as a given, which is shocking actually when you think about it, that,
It's interesting because, of course, when we look at Artemisia Gentileschi probably being the first woman to have a solo show at the National Gallery, of course 1% of women, at the time 1% of women were in the canon. Now I think it's 70% that are going into art schools. So I think that's another issue. It's not that there is a smaller area. I'd love to hear about your journey and also how different it is actually getting ready for this museum show rather than painting for a gallery like the Victoria Moreau that we mentioned.
Well, my journey, my year at university was all women, apart from one man, and he was furious. We had one feminist lecture.
And where is he now?
Furious. Yeah, I don't know where he is now. Probably still angry about that lecture. So I think as I was kind of studying and things, I found that it was women artists that I was gravitating towards most. I mean, Jenny Saville, Cecily Brown, Fiona Ray, Lisa Scavage, and these are the people that still surround me in my studio. So I feel that though I'm looking at lots of male artists, it kind of feels, I don't know, it feels like painting is as much for women in my studio anyway.
Yeah.
In terms of the Ashmolean show, it's been a really nice experience because it's sort of like its own little project because it's in response to the collection. So I went and spent a week up there and went and looked through their collection, which is so enormous. I tried to start at the beginning and just go around it. Like in a whole day, I got like through one room. But it was like what Katy was saying about the hierarchies of aesthetics sort of led me to look at the Dutch still life they have there. They have this wonderful room that's just these exquisite examples, lots painted by women. And so that's kind of what I'm focusing on. And it's quite nice to be, because I usually look at 18th century paintings, and so I'm sort of looking at a bit earlier in a different place in Europe, and it's quite sort of given me the permission to look at other stuff.
And I want to take a step back as well, back to the first question, and make sure that when we talk about diversity, we are not talking about this progress at the exclusion of men. So there is an extraordinary Lucienne Freud show at the National Gallery. There is an extraordinary Cézanne show at Tate. But I think diversity is an interesting question because obviously when you spoke to Edward on our Chanel Connects podcast series in the middle of lockdown, you and Edward Enenfeld and Tilda Swinton discussed storytelling in its broadest sense of the arts. We on this panel very obviously are missing diversity when it comes to race. And so I wanted to think about, yes, equity in terms of gender is something we're addressing, equity, not at the exclusion of the other. But then in terms of that racial diversity, do you think there is progress? Is there equity? How will that be addressed in your collection? How is that being addressed in the story of art?
Should I start? It's a really good point. And I think, as Katy said, there's times that you have to really kind of focus. The fantastic work that Katy's doing, the work that we're doing at the MPG, is really necessary work, otherwise it just wouldn't happen. And of course you want to get to a point where then those things kind of stitch together to talk about craft, which is sometimes seen as, a feminine realm in the art world. And there's a lot of other things to think about. I mean, in terms of our collection, we also need to do a lot of work around sitters of color. You also need to think about also who your audience is and who you're hiring, like who works at the gallery. Like there's so many issues just in the kind of art sector, the museum sector, I'll talk about my own sector, around especially class and race. Those are two massive areas, which is kind of systemic in this country for all kinds of reasons. It's because, if you go to a state school, you're not really taught about art history or the art world or anything else. I could go on and be here all day, I won't. But of course you want to get to a point. It's not about creating silos, it's actually about opening things up and then joining them together. And you want to get to a point where, as you said, like everyone feels invited, as Edward said so beautifully, and at the gallery we really feel we're a national institution. We want to also get people excited about, the nation's history and to look at overlooked stories. But we want people to come in and feel inspired, but also represented, and to walk around and to see people that they can relate to in whatever shape or form that takes. So there's a lot of work to do. I think it's going in the right direction. We're making progress, but I think we can't be complacent.
Who wants to talk to Elizabeth Virginie Lebron? Because it's interesting when we talk about class, who had access. Maybe that's a character that you'd like to showcase for this group.
Yeah, so Elizabeth Vijay Lebron was an extraordinary artist working in the kind of Ancien regime in the 1780s, and she was Marie Antoinette's favourite portraitist, and I think she painted her 30 times. I mean, she wasn't necessarily from a wealthy background. She just had an absolute sort of grit and determination and was, totally making the same money as her male counterparts. But I guess, she did enter that class system. And I think, it's such an interesting question about race and class, because I think, what I try to do in this book as well is include people of all different races. And actually the thing is that, again, back to education, there was this extraordinary exhibition at Tate Modern a few years ago called Soul of a Nation, Art in the Age of Black Power. And I didn't even know about art made in the civil rights movement until I saw that exhibition. I was about 23 or 24 at the time, so it took that long to actually learn about who Betty Saar was, or Faith Ringgold, all these extraordinary artists who have been just pioneering, throughout history and were completely overlooked in their time. And I think it's so important to really highlight, that this book very much sort of goes around the world. We look at 19th century Japan and everything, and also to spotlight those who also were not from wealthy backgrounds as well.
Do you think it's getting better? I would love to hear from Flora, from Nick, in terms of whether the access, the equity of who is able to go into the arts has changed.
Oh, that's a really good question. I guess, yes, I think who is able to get in, but it's a really long slog and you need to have a studio, and studio prices are going up. So there needs to be more funding and stuff at the levels where, it can take 50 years to start selling work and be able to make a living from it. And then if you throw in like anyone who has childcare issues or any care of any sort, then it becomes really problematic. So I think access, yes, but maintenance needs, I think, more focus.
Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting correlation, though, within the rise of the internet and Instagram as well, and the rise of diversity and democratization of art. I think the internet has played an extraordinary role in telling people that, not only educating people about art, art, but saying, you can put your work on Instagram and you might be able to sell it.
People can make their own platform, yeah. They don't have to wait to be given one. Yeah.
But I think, that's that's kind of how I started, because I was 21 and I had no gallery or no, my parents weren't going to buy me a gallery or anything. So I had to start, always use what you've got. And it's like my first ever exhibition was in a foyer of an advertising agency, because they gave me that, and I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. So I always think, use what you've got around you. But I think it's probably harder than ever to be an artist. I mean, when you look at the 1990s in Britain with the YBAs, so many of those artists were working class, and they were able to be artists because rent was cheap, and they were, and school, you didn't have university fees. And I think we're at a total, that again, we can, another, sorry.
No, go on.
No, just that fact that the university system in this country is completely screwed.
Yeah, I'm pretty worried right now. I mean, it's a conversation to have, but I think the fact that currently the cultural industries are not being valued is a big concern. And again, you really have to begin in secondary school. I do a lot of work with this fantastic charity called Speakers for Schools, where you do talks in state secondary schools. And whenever I'm going around the country or going home to see my family, you can do a talk, and you can talk to sometimes 400 or 500 teenagers. And if just one or two of those people kind of get inspired from that, I've had people come up to me and say they weren't going to go to university, but now they were reconsidering, realizing that, anyone can go, you don't have to come from a certain background. So there is a lot of work to do. There's just so much talent out there. It's just a shame if it gets deselected before it's even had time to kind of make an impact.
It's great, and that I guess probably takes me back to reality television and what Instagram accounts you're following. But just in terms of media, what is driving that insight factory for you? How are you really generating your inspiration, and then how are you sharing out in terms of that cycle?
I guess I try to absorb as much as possible, but I really like cookies and things that send things my way.
Oh, you like that? So meanwhile, we're all deselecting, accept all, manage my profile. You're like, yes, tell me what I need to know.
Because everyone of a similar demographic to me is being bathed in the same kind of information. So it's sort of this specificity, and I enjoy that it's shared. I guess, I just watch as much as possible and try.
What are you watching? Just give us some insights on what Flora is doing on any given. What's that?
The new Kardashian season.
New Kardashian season.
Actually, mostly that. I think we need some more good reality TV out there. That's another thing that.
Where do we see the Kardashians in your Fragonardian image? When you say you are influenced by Doja Cat or Lady Gaga or Kim Kardashian, can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think it's the theatricality and sort of serving up really exciting, beautiful things that we want to watch and look at, but also the massive wealth inequality and the fact that there is something, it's not even aspirational because it's just unattainable. It's just glossy and glorious, and it's escapist. And I think there was a lot of that going on at the same time in sort of 18th century France.
I love that duality, because one might be attracted to your work for its beauty, but I think interestingly, like Brian Cox with Logan Roy, what you see is not always what you get. So I love that there is that political dimension in that. Coming back to what you said, Nick, it's very interesting in terms of where we are in the UK right now and how we think about funding progress. I arrived in '97, it was the dawn of a new Labour, it was sensations at the Royal Academy, and there was something really cool, as Edward said, about living in squats, and the show on BBC now, Sensationalists, I think takes us back to this era of the great creation post Damien Hirst's Freeze, of that YBA movement that almost thrived on the tension we see. What's interesting now is, in dialogue yesterday with Maria Balshaw and Max Holein, the director of the Met and the director of the Tate have very similar ambitions in terms of reframing the narrative, in terms of widening audiences, in terms of applying technology. But the economic reality is just so different. When we look at America, when we look at the extensions, the new monuments that are going up across the country. And here we're facing a winter of discontent. We're on our 17th cultural minister, I believe, in 16 years. So the question is, with all this progress, how are you, or with all of this strife, how are you funding the progress that's needed? What kind of innovation are we having to bring into the arts?
Good question. It's not like the easiest time. I mean, what I would say is we've been very lucky at the Gallery. We've done very well in terms of fundraising for the capital project, like the bricks and mortar and the rehang, but also other things. So really focusing on the collection, working with the Chanel Culture Fund. So you can find people that will support you. And actually what's very interesting is, to go back to this point about diversity, it makes economic and business sense. Like, so many corporate supporters right now are focusing on social justice. So there's certain things we're doing where people actively want to fund it, and it kind of it chimes with their values and what they want to do. So in terms of that, we're not suffering. I think that my biggest concern is the next generation up and coming, and what we can do to kind of make sure that, this is going to be a very hard time economically for all of us in some way, shape or form over the next few years, but especially for young people who are, just about to go to university or just trying to begin a career or get their first job, that this doesn't mean that they're, again, sort of taken out of the pool before they've even had a chance to start. There's one thing I'll mention, which Katy and I are both getting involved with, which is Tracy Emin's artist residency in Margate, and you're going to be the writer in residence.
Yes.
And I'm going to do some kind of teaching to be confirmed.
Flora, what will you be doing in Margate with Tracy?
I'm going up to visit.
Definitely, yeah.
Paying our admission price.
Yeah.
So there's things like this too, where there's initiatives where people are funding or starting up their own, and those residencies, they're free for artists, which is a fantastic thing to be able to do. So I think we have to be hopeful, but yeah, I'm concerned, and I think we have to think about the future of the next few years and what we can do to support people.
I would love to, in a moment, turn it over to the audience for questions, but while you think of those, this weekend it's all about literature, but somewhere else far, far away in the land called London, it is Frieze Week, it is Frieze Masters Week, it is Pad Week, it is a real engine of activity when it comes to the arts. We're seeing great shows by Black women artists like Amy Sherald. We're seeing terrific museum exhibitions. So I'd love to hear from you, what makes you optimistic compared to the fair environment you entered into where there were no women, but really to hear some of the exciting things that you still might be able to catch tomorrow in London, or at least to have on your radar.
You mentioned Amy Sherald. So for those who don't know Amy Sherald, she's an extraordinary painter, African-American painter, portraitist, and she very famously painted Michelle Obama a few years ago for her. She was the first woman and African-American to actually paint a presidential portrait, which is extraordinary. But there are these dazzling portraits of these, everyday African-American people, and, some of them are on tractors, or some of them just sort of bathing this sort of like gold celestial space sometimes. And there's the most amazing painting is of these two male sailors kissing, and it's just divine, because she was on my podcast this week, and I was saying how insane that it's got to 2022 and we still haven't had a picture of two African-American males kissing in a gallery. And what she does, she elevates these subjects on these such grand scales. And I think it's such an interesting conversation between, Amy Sherald sort of coming into here to Hauser and Wirth, and then what's happening at the National Gallery, and the fact that we're still not seeing those stories represented. Yeah. And it gives me so much hope, because also, there's fly posters on the tube, and I love the fact that, kids, my big thing is that I hope like a kid picks up this book and feels like they can see themselves in it, because that's the most important thing.
Yeah. And just to add to that and to answer your question, I curate the Frieze Masters Talks program, and actually Amy Sherald did a talk this week, and it was really mind-blowing. And she said this extraordinary thing. She talked about how she grew up in Baltimore, but she went to Washington, D.C., to the National Gallery, and she saw an African-American subject in a kind of 19th century work given dignity, and she said for her, that's where her work began, and the penny dropped that what would it mean to her, and therefore to other African Americans, to see themselves reflected in museums and monuments. I thought it was such an incredible thing, and it makes you realize, like, if people can't see themselves given that status, they can't even imagine it for themselves as an individual. So just to answer your point, I was really kind of blown away by Amy, but also Tyler Mitchell, who's this fantastic young photographer. He was the first photographer the first African-American photographer to make the cover of American Vogue with Beyonce when he was 23. He's still 27.
Just 2 years ago, 3 years ago.
Yeah,
very,
blows my
very
mind.
recently.
And yeah, I feel very optimistic about the younger generation. And what I would say, I've been in this industry now for like 20 years, and I think it's so important that the longer you're in an industry, and in a way the more privilege you have, which I now do, I don't come from that, but I now have it, is to remain curious and to become ever more generous and try to really pass things on to other people.
That's a beautiful theme, I think, that is recurring on the stage.
Yeah.
Flora?
Just amazing shows all around London for free that everyone can see. Samaya Critchlow has an incredible show at Maximilian William, which I recommend everyone goes to see.
It's interesting on that point of Amy. I had the pleasure of seeing her one evening, and she talked about her show, but then she also had with her the daughter of her heart donor. And I thought how open she was about her persona, about being a visible woman. And it made me think, Flora, how much pressure is there on you to keep telling your story when so much of your telling is probably already in your art? Do you feel there's a particular onus on you as a young woman so beloved by museums and the market? How does that feel? It's happened very quickly.
What do you mean in terms of like biography?
In terms of people wanting to say, Flora, tell us your story.
Yeah.
How did this happen? You're so young.
Yeah, I don't have much that's that interesting to say. I really love painting, so I kind of hope that like people just look at that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry.
I think for that exact reason, it is so generous of you to be on the stage, because it's really demanding of an artist to make them create such works of beauty and challenge, and also then to have to talk about it. But thank you for your services to the arts. I'd love to open it up to some questions. I think Jenny Russell in the back.
Hello. I've read half of Katy's book, which is absolutely superb, and I recommend it to all of you. It's a gripping story. But I'm a journalist, I'm a columnist for The Times. Nicholas, I was disturbed when you said that you looked at the artists who are being represented at Venice this year and you didn't see gender, because classically if one doesn't see something, then one can't identify whether or not there's a problem with it.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether you meant that in general you don't think about gender when you look at art. But I see that you've been a curator for 15 years. When did you first become aware of the fact that you felt there might be an issue with the gender representation in art history?
I think unless you're either incredibly complacent or ignorant, you know that from the get-go. I mean, when I was studying art history, it's very clear that and as Katy was saying, the further back you go, the worse the problem is. What I was saying about Venice, and it is true, I have to say that when at the gallery, we programmed a lot of exhibitions for women artists, as it turned out. But that actually had to be pointed out to me. I tend to approach things very instinctively, whatever I do. And I focus on things that I think are exciting or excellent. I focus on the quality of something, not necessarily the demographic that lies behind it. That's very important too. But the way that I approach things is not to think, okay, we need a quota, so we need someone, of this background. And so, that's my personal approach. It's actually interesting what Flora's saying. I have to say, the reason that at the MPG we've been programming so many women artists is not because we wanted to make a political point. It's because I think that's where some of the best portraiture is being made right now. That's just my own personal opinion, but I think other people would also agree. So that's just what I do. That's my approach. And in Venice, yeah, obviously it was framed very clearly that one of the important things about this Venice Biennale, unlike a lot of them before, and almost every one, is that women would be the majority. So you knew that, and that's very important. But again, I have to say, when I was walking around, and I stick with what I said, I wasn't thinking, that's not a woman, that's a woman. I was enjoying these extraordinary works and discovering new artists. So yeah, I don't know.
You work instinctively, but as Katy points out, we are culturally programmed to see some things as great art and others not. Women's crafts, for instance, have never been so. So there must be a conscious effort that's taking place now to try and redefine what is good and what is great. And is that happening across all the artistic institutions now?
I think it's definitely happening now, which is good. But again, to Flora's point, I'm just curious about so many things, including getting away from the kind of very hierarchical idea of what art is. It's not just painting, it's also things that are called craft, for example. And so I think, again, if you're curious and you want to discover new things, as I always do, that inevitably takes you into different territory. Yeah.
And also I think there's been a total recognition in, it's such a funny thing, craft, because normally craft and design has been seen as these kind of lesser genres as well. And actually when we look at what's happening in the Hayward this year, they're having a huge exhibition about ceramics. And actually for the first time in history, institutions are taking these different art forms seriously. And I just think it's a great thing because it just opens up another sort of ecosystem of artists and stories that need and deserve to be heard. So everyone feels like they're included in this story.
The Geo Lens is actually very interesting because we work globally to think about how to elevate women's voices, but also focus on the next and the new, and to activate history to dictate the future. And with our Chinese partner, we went to the Great Museum in Shanghai, the Power Station of Art, and we said, what is your most urgent issue? And they said the cultural production around craft. So how do we take that conversation further? So gender blind in a sense, but really thinking, how do we take some of this antiquated thinking and drive it forward with technology and innovation and some of these conversations at the fore? Front row.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for your time. I do have two questions for you. The first one is pertaining to the fact that, and some elements that you've raised, diversity in a more general way, the fact that you mentioned that it could be a trend, this type of idea of rebalancing, and also the fact that we're potentially, when it comes to cultural institutions, in a sort of dire economic situation. When we see this, do you think that there's maybe a risk that there could be a sort of competition between the different underrepresented voices, and that because of that, we could be kind of like at risk of prioritizing one over the other, just because it's perceived in a way, because we don't have the funds to address everything at the same time? And the other one is, you mentioned in your book, Katy, especially at the beginning, you talk about those great artists from the Renaissance that at this time were also revered, and that were recognized, they had commissions, and they were re-recognized at the time. And that also at times were the first ones to experiment with a certain type of imagery or technique. And do you think, because this happened before, if we don't do something really big bang in terms of impact, this could happen again? And if so, what would you think we should do to prevent that from re-happening? Because now we have great artists such as Flora and this new generation that we see, but if this happened before, how do we prevent this from happening again?
I think it's such an important point, because the amount of people who say to me, oh my God, like, you're so young, you're going to see all these trends, fall and rise again or whatever, like we've seen it all before. I mean, as long as I'm alive, I'm going to keep fighting for this subject, so hopefully I've got a long life to live. But, it's such an important point, because I also think, we see these big auction houses or, saying, okay, great sort of women artist exhibition. And actually, that's not the point. It's about creating these really vital, important stories. Yes, maybe we are going to make an exhibition about women artists or write the story of art, but there needs to be a point, and it needs to be done properly. I mean, the amount of people who say as well to me, God, you're sort of so right place, right time. And I say, absolutely not. This is half the world's population. And these are stories that need to be taken seriously. And what Flora said, it's about creating these vital scholarship and resources that are going to carry, that are going to last forever. The amount of people who come up to me and just want me to curate this or that, but there needs to always be meaning and grit behind something, which I think, again, and also focus, I think. So, for example, with you, it's about sitters and about the artist in portraits. We can't do everything. We can't magic something overnight. Progress takes a while, but it's about finding your area and championing that.
And can I answer the second part of the question, or the first part of the question? But you were basically saying, if you focus on one area, is there the risk that other ones are overlooked? Can I paraphrase it that way? I would really hope not, and it needn't be the case. And I think it's very important to say that. There's not this kind of quantum theory over visibility or diversity, and if you're going to focus on women, then therefore other things are not being attended to. That's just not the case. And I think we need to kind of remove that idea and insist that isn't. I'm a big believer in solidarity. I think with other people that perhaps also don't look like you or don't have the same experience. I think it's very interesting to champion what you know, but I think it's also very important to reach out and to think about how, if you've ever felt othered or not given a voice or not visible, how would other people also experience that, and to build bridges between that. So I think that's crucially important.
Maybe, Flora, in terms of techniques, is technology? Is there progress? I remember some of the greatest inventions were like the tube of paint that suddenly allowed artists to paint outside and led to that evolution of Impressionism in the late 19th century. What does the evolution of techniques and image making mean to you as you look ahead?
Well, I think that there's been a massive kind of revival of painting, and everyone's very excited about painting because I think I think it's possibly the best material for expressing what it's like to live at the moment with all of the many types of imagery you're always seeing and switching between old and new, having your camera open, your internet open and seeing all of these things, and you can kind of compress them. So I think it's going to be more the way that we consume imagery and things like that that's going to lead us. I think that, I've got a friend who tutors at university, and she says that very few of the young students are considering themselves painters or sculptors or anything like that. They're very multimedia, and I think maybe that's more the way things are going to end up going.
Yeah, that interdisciplinarity is so interesting. And it's fascinating, as you say, in terms of the times that we're in, that, as Gerhard Richter said, art is the greatest form of hope. So the beauty is really fascinating. Natalie Livingston.
First of all, that was fascinating. We how absolutely ignorant I am, and I'm dying to know more. I'm dying to read the book. I just wondered, Flora, we're so lucky to have an artist of your magnitude here. Earlier on today, when Edward Enninful was being interviewed, somebody asked him how he goes about his creative process, and he said, he doesn't do it like a normal person. He basically closes his eyes and wakes up one morning, and there's this incredible story that literally comes out of him. I'm just wondering if you could just enlighten me about your creative process and how you manage to make these works of absolute brilliance.
The process.
No pressure.
Well, I guess I'm trying to focus on it more and focus less on the work that comes out at the moment. I'm trying to get back into the studio and think of it as like a machine and try and make the machine as good as possible. But I guess I'm really interested in kind of getting as many images together as possible and trying to see the commonalities across history and try and recognize those threads. And that's what makes me excited about making. And then I'll just start with one image and start pulling in all the others and see where it leads me. And hopefully I'll start to understand the way these images are working on me. And it's kind of this process of sort of like digging through history, I guess. I don't know if that answers your question.
But Flora's studio is extraordinary. I mean, there's literally a picture on every single centimetre of the whole floor, and actually, she's being very humble, but I mean, I've learnt so much about history through Flora's paintings, and when you really sort of get to the sort of grit of Venus, or all these different mythological creatures or stories or everything, it's so interesting, the kind of culmination that you do end up putting together in your work.
We're excited tomorrow to have a Sunday salon, which will bring a focus to young creative writers and historians. It'll be fascinating in parallel to think how young writers are addressing some of these issues. So hopefully this is the right place to be exploring these themes with Flora. I see some more hands here particularly.
This is another question for Flora. For feminist artists in the late 1900s, oil paint, as you mentioned, was like a medium that was tainted by the patriarchy. Is your choice to use that medium and to kind of reassess great images of art history out of feminist motivation or just an interest in the history of art?
I really love the material of paint, and that is kind of what makes me like so excited to keep doing it every day. It was more feeling like, if I'm going to do this, what does it mean in the context of today, and what is everyone going to assume already exists in the meaning of this work? So it became important to tackle gender as part of that, and then it's just become something that I've enjoyed learning about and exploring, I guess.
There's one here in the middle.
Hi, I also have a question for Flora. One of the more shocking things that you said during the discussion was talking about the role of reality television shows and what that had for your art. When I think of reality television, I think of the word indulgent or trite or silly, and I was fascinated to hear you talk about that and this kind of current moment where we live in, where we all kind of see this, play out. So could you talk a little bit more about how that inspires you? What does that mean for your creative process, and how do you represent that? And are there other current phenomena that you are inspired by similarly to reality TV?
Yeah, I think in terms of the richness of the aesthetic, I get that from reality TV, but I also get it from music videos and these sort of places where everything is kind of very bright and very in your face, and I love that, and I find it really exciting. And I think as someone living today, everything is kind of advertised at you, so the idea of images coming at you and trying to get your attention it feels kind of the right language to be looking at. I don't think reality TV is trite. I actually think it's really smart, and I think it's really interesting, and different shows have different benefits, but I think there is no better place to explore the post-truth condition and the way that media is used to spin a story, which is so relevant to the way that we kind of consume politics and read about the news and understand what is really going on. I actually think reality TV is an amazing low-stakes arena to kind of explore that in. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. Here from Genevieve.
Can you hear me? In terms of putting theory into practice, please forgive the ignorance of this question, but is there the equivalent in art of the Women's Prize for Fiction in art? And if there isn't, are you going to create one?
Yeah.
I think Nick will probably reference a prize that has been around for a while, and not to plug, but the Chanel Next Prize has gone out and thought about how do we channel Gabrielle Chanel's spirit of wanting to be part of what happens next. There is a focus on women, but there is also a focus on interdisciplinarity. So I would raise the question of whether prizes for women's art are really the way to go. There is a terrific one, but I think there's also a great focus on making sure that women are seen alongside all gender, all race, all class, so that they can really be celebrated. At least that's how we look at it for the next prize. Nick?
Yeah, I mean, there's the Max Mara Award, which the Whitechapel Gallery in London has had for several years, which is focused on women artists. So that's one answer to your question, but hopefully there's other potential answers in the future. And I think, Yana referenced also the Chanel Culture Fund Prize, so more work to do. I would say I hope it's not all on prizes, though, because prizes can be very important for artists. They can give, a platform and visibility, money, which is necessary, but they can also be quite divisive. So I think that's one thing which is important, but I wouldn't want that to be a kind of distraction from more systemic change.
I think that's a beautiful note to end on in terms of the systemic change, because seeing shows like Flora's at the Ashmolean, following Katy's progress on her podcasts at the Great Women Artists, and through all the projects I know she has lined up, and watching this space that will reopen at the National Portrait Gallery in 23 will certainly show us how we further that progress. I think to finish on some philosophical words from Socrates, that the progress to change is not on spending all one's energy on fighting the old, but on driving forward the new. So I think with that, I just want to send a tremendous thanks to our speakers and to the audience. Thank you very much.